находимся в штабе. 7 часов 30 минут утра под контролем.
In June this year, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner private military company, led an armed rebellion in Russia, presenting his former mentor, President Vladimir Putin, with one of the most dramatic challenges to his power in decades. Prigozhin questioned the Kremlin's motives for invading Ukraine and accused the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu of ordering deadly airstrikes on Wagner fighters. Speculation about Yevgeny Prigozhin's eventual fate soon began after his march on Russia. And exactly 2 months later, on the 23rd of August, the mercenary leader's private jet fell out of the sky. Russia's investigative committee, which investigates serious crimes in the country, confirmed on the 27th of August the head of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was among the 10 people killed in a plane crash.
Пригожина я знал очень давно, с начала 90-х годов. Это был человек сложной судьбы, и ошибки у него были серьезные в жизни, и добивался он результатов нужных и для себя, и тогда, когда я его просил об этом для общего дела, как вот в эти последние месяцы.
Details of what exactly occurred in the aftermath of Prigozhin's death remain murky. However, an old video of the mercenary group's chief has gone viral, rekindling conspiracy theories surrounding his death in a plane crash in Russia. In the video, Prigozhin is seen drawing an unsettling analogy between Russia's wartime trajectory and an impending plane disintegration mid-flight.
Лучше убейте меня. Но я не буду обманывать, я должен честно сказать, Россия стоит на грани катастрофы. Если сегодня не отрегулировать эти винтики, то самолет рассыпется в воздухе.
In this episode, we understand who was Yevgeny Prigozhin. When and how did Putin's friendship with Prigozhin turn ugly? And is there any convincing evidence pointing to the Kremlin's involvement in the crash?
So I don't believe that Putin was somehow involved in this tragic story. However, it's very difficult for me to believe that it was an accident. Even though, yes, Prigozhin had his private jet, and that private jet did not have spare parts since the beginning of the Western sanctions against Russia last year. So theoretically, it is not to be excluded that something malfunctioned in the plane. But I'm surprised why the world media does not view the version that he could be targeted by Ukrainian or Western special services.
During the post-coup period, the story didn't make sense that a colleague of Putin would turn against him. And Putin's response was, hey, don't worry about it. Go to Belarus. Let's let bygones be bygones. This is not Vladimir Putin. He destroys his enemies. He does not accommodate them. We don't yet know exactly how and why this aircraft came down. The predominant theory from the U.S. intelligence services is that there was a bomb on board because there's no clear signature of a missile that hit the plane. But I think it's safe to say that there's a pretty good likelihood that this was a deliberate explosion that took down the plane in an effort to kill not just Prigozhin, but other key leaders of Wagner.
What's next for Wagner after Prigozhin's death? And what does this mean for Russia and its war in Ukraine? We decode this and more. 62-year-old Yevgeny Prigozhin headed the mercenary group Wagner. The Wagner Group was first identified in 2014 when it started backing pro-Russian separatist forces in eastern Ukraine. In the same year, it also helped Russia annex Crimea. Wagner had about 5,000 fighters, mostly veterans of Russia's elite regiments and special forces. However, its numbers have grown considerably since the war in Ukraine. The group now claims to have 25,000 troops. Although mercenary forces are technically illegal in Russia, Wagner registered as a company in 2022, and over the years the group has become the de facto private army of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Born in St. Petersburg in Russia on the 1st of June in 1961, Prigozhin spent 9 years in Soviet prisons for crimes including robbery and fraud. He was released in 1990, a year before the Soviet Union dissolved. He launched a career as a caterer and restaurateur. He's believed to have met Putin, then a top aide to St. Petersburg's mayor, at this time. Leveraging political connections, Prigozhin was awarded major state contracts. He became known as Putin's chef after catering for Kremlin events. More recently, he joked that Putin's butcher would be more appropriate. These photos show him serving George Bush, among others. Even though Prigozhin and his mercenaries had become increasingly important for stamping President Putin's authority, the Kremlin kept maintaining that it had no connection to him. Thus, Prigozhin, too, kept a low public profile. Even as Wagner conducted operations on Moscow's behalf in Syria and in several African countries, Prigozhin denied any affiliation.
Подразделения ЧВК «Вагнер» практически окружили Бахмут.
Prigozhin soared to prominence only after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The Wagner fighters led the Russian assault on the city of Bakhmut in the longest and bloodiest battle of the war. Prigozhin later used social media to boast about his successes.
Можно поздравить всех парней, которые воюют, которые находятся на передовой, в госпитале, военных, которые
As Russian forces were forced into a series of retreats in Ukraine, Prigozhin escalated his criticism.
Они пришли сюда добровольцами.
He complained that the army command was refusing to recognize the mercenaries' contribution to the war effort. In fact, he clashed with the president's close ally, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and with the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Army, Valery Gerasimov, accusing them of starving Wagner ammunition while the group was losing thousands of men in the fight for Bakhmut in the east of Ukraine.
У нас нехватка боеприпасов 70%. Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы? Посмотрите на них,
Right in the middle of the war against Ukraine, Prigozhin dared to challenge the Kremlin chief. The Kremlin steered clear of commenting on the escalating feud, but it was a row that shook Russia's leadership to its core. Prigozhin refused a defense ministry demand to bring all mercenary groups under its control. As the situation reached a boiling point, he dared to question the very goals of the war.
Война нужна была олигархам. Она нужна была тому клану, который сегодня фактически управляет Россией.
So, on the 23rd of June, Prigozhin announced a march for justice on the road to Moscow. Prigozhin led an armed mutiny against Russia's military leadership, occupying the command center in Rostov-on-Don. He shot down 2 military helicopters and a plane and killed up to 15 Russian soldiers. Putin called Prigozhin a traitor.
Мы не дадим этому повториться. Защитим и наш народ, и нашу государственность от любых угроз. В том числе от внутреннего предательства. А то, с чем мы столкнулись, это именно предательство. Непомерные амбиции и личные интересы привели к измене. К измене и своей стране, и своему народу, и тому делу, за которое бок о бок с другими нашими частями и подразделениями сражались и погибали бойцы и командиры группы «Вагнер».
This botched revolt was the final rift between Putin and Prigozhin. But there was no showdown. Instead, a deal was reached between Prigozhin and the Kremlin, mediated by the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. As per the deal, Wagner mercenary force chief Yevgeny Prigozhin relocated to Belarus. The criminal cases against Prigozhin, which were registered on the 24th of June, were dropped. The deal also ensured that other Wagner troops didn't face any punitive action for the rebellion by Russia. After the deal, Wagner forces began to leave the Russian military facilities they had occupied under the rebellion. Ever since Prigozhin led a rebellious march on Moscow, he was described by observers as a dead man walking. Prigozhin made a lot of enemies in Moscow, most notably in the upper ranks of the Russian military, whose leaders he frequently and publicly criticized. In one of Putin's video messages, he called Prigozhin's march on Moscow a betrayal and a stab in the back.
И потому действия, которые раскалывают наше единство, это, по сути, отступничество от своего народа, от боевых товарищей, которые сражаются сейчас на фронте. Это удар в спину нашей стране и нашему народу.
Работаем. Температура плюс 50. Все как мы любим.
The Russian mercenary chief posted his first video address since leading a short-lived revolt in Russia. The video appeared to be shot in Africa.
Справедливость и счастье для африканских народов.
In the video, Prigozhin insisted he was recruiting for operations in Africa, while also inviting investors from Russia to put money in the Central African Republic, or CAR, through Russian House, a cultural center in the African country's capital. And on the 23rd of August, as Prigozhin was flying over the north of Moscow with other senior Wagner leaders, his private jet that had been flying between Moscow and St. Petersburg crashed and fell over Russia. "33 minutes into the flight, while over a kilometer south of the village of Kuzhenkino in the Tver region, the aircraft called Embraer Legacy rapidly lost altitude and contact. Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin was confirmed to have died following DNA testing of the bodies found in the wreckage. But it was not only Prigozhin who perished in the incident. Dmitry Utkin, often described as the co-founder of the mercenary group, and a shadowy figure whose call sign Wagner allegedly inspired the Russian private mercenary group's name, died alongside Prigozhin. The private jet was carrying 7 passengers and 3 crew members. All 10 people on board were killed. The bodies are said to have been recovered. Prigozhin's sudden death in a plane crash has sparked many conspiracy theories. His supporters claimed on pro-Wagner messaging app channels that the plane had been deliberately downed. Meanwhile, the US and Western officials have said the plane was probably brought down by an intentional explosion leading to it crashing into a field. Suspicions swiftly centered on Vladimir Putin, with the US saying it was very likely that he was the architect of the incident.
I don't know for a fact what happened, but I'm not surprised.
Do you think Putin was responsible?
There's not much that happens when Russia and Putin not behind.
But Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov flatly rejected the allegations.
Смотрите, сейчас, естественно, вокруг этой авиакатастрофы и вокруг трагической гибели пассажиров самолета, в том числе Евгения Пригожина, очень много спекуляций. Конечно же, на Западе все эти спекуляции подаются с известного угла. Все это ложь абсолютно. И здесь, конечно, нужно исключительно, освещая эту проблематику, основываться все-таки на фактах. Фактов пока немного, потому что их еще предстоит выяснить в ходе следственных действий, которые сейчас выполняют.
Amidst all these allegations, what's unclear is why were several high-ranking members of Wagner on the same flight? What was the purpose of their trip to St. Petersburg? And most importantly, how did the plane crash?
There are lots of conspiracy theories around Wagner's death. The main conspiracy theories is vented by the Western media, that somehow the president was involved in this. But there are no facts confirming these theories. There is a widespread theory in Russia that somehow Mr. Prigozhin is alive, that it was someone else who was on that plane. But there is no proof behind it. It's just conspiracy theories.
President Vladimir Putin has been the most powerful man in Russia for more than 20 years. In this period, numerous opponents and vehement critics of the Kremlin have died under mysterious circumstances. Let's take a look at some of them. Once deputy prime minister under Boris Yeltsin, Boris Nemtsov was a popular politician and harsh critic of Vladimir Putin. On a cold February night in 2015, Boris Nemtsov was walking across a bridge in Moscow after dining with his Ukrainian girlfriend, when an unknown assailant shot him several times in the back. Nemtsov died almost instantly, but his girlfriend escaped unhurt. In 2018, Pyotr Verzilov, founder of the Russian protest group Pussy Riot, embarrassed the Kremlin by running onto the field during the Football World Cup final in Moscow with 3 other activists to protest police brutality. Later that year, Pyotr Verzilov fell severely ill and was flown to Berlin, where doctors said poisoning was highly plausible. Verzilov eventually recovered, but his allies believed he had been targeted because of his activism. In August 2020, opposition leader Alexei Navalny fell ill on a flight from Siberia to Moscow. The plane made an emergency landing in Omsk. Later, after an international outcry, Navalny was flown to Germany for treatment, where doctors put him into a coma. He recovered over a period of months. His allies claimed he was poisoned with the Soviet-era nerve agent Novichok, and labs in Germany, France and Sweden have confirmed this. While the Kremlin has repeatedly rejected any suggestion that Russia tried to kill Navalny, a Russian agent sent to tail the opposition leader has confessed how the activists' underpants were smeared with the toxin by an intelligence unit from the Russian Federal Security Service, or FSB. Navalny, an anti-corruption campaigner, returned to Russia and was convicted of extremism in August 2023. He has been sentenced to 19 years in prison.
Well, there are lots of other Russians that have been thrown in jail, that have been roughed up because they have expressed opposition to the war in Ukraine. Many other Russians have left the country, either because they faced conscription and the likelihood of battle in Ukraine, or because they were Russians who were not willing to keep quiet and felt that they were unsafe staying inside Russia. We've also seen individuals who were once part of the Russian government or the security apparatus, defectors, if you will, show up in the United States and other countries. The Russians go after them. This is now a regime that does not tolerate dissent at home or abroad. And as a consequence, Putin casts a very wide net when he tries to silence his opponents.
On the 29th of August, Prigozhin was buried in a small private ceremony in St. Petersburg. A black flag bearing the insignia of the Wagner Group hung above the cemetery plot where Prigozhin was laid to rest. Putin did not attend the funeral, and it was closed to outsiders. Much like Prigozhin's life, his end, too, was shrouded in secrecy.